I think I'll begin. Today, I've handed out the drawing I want to talk about. There are copies floating about. I'll say more about it in a moment. I mean, just to be, autobiographical for a second, I've had a long-standing interest in Freud's drawings and Freud's continual use of drawing and sketching to illustrate what he's trying to do. And the drawing I've handed out comes from a letter to Wilhelm Fliess written very early in Freud's career. But throughout his attempt to develop a psychoanalytic theory or to develop a theory, he always drew. And and as you know, as architects, one of the interesting things about having dinner or drink with an architect is that halfway into it the pen comes out and the bit of paper, and it's as though thinking is impossible without the attendant activity of drawing, as though drawing does something that's always in addition to words, or something can only be made clear by the act of drawing. So then it becomes then of interest to me that Freud draws and continues to draw throughout his career. He includes drawings, this is one I'm showing you, that are included in letters he sends to people in order to make his points clearer, because he feels he can't write them. And I'm then quite interested in this idea that you can't write something, you can only draw it, as though the act of writing is always in some sense not inferior to, but it can't do what the drawn line can do. And so therefore there is something then that separates, in Freud, but I think in general, the activity of drawing from the activity of writing. And it's not simply that every picture's worth 1,000 words or anything as ridiculous as that. It's much rather that the activity of drawing seems to, and it's this seems to that interests me, seems to occupy a different status or have a different status or occupy a different role in the attempt to convey something. And it's that attempt to convey something that I want to just dwell on for a moment before I start. Because to convey something is to send something over. In other words, to convey something is to present something. What does a drawn line present? Well, it presents itself. What does some piece of writing present? Well, it presents itself. But the materiality of writing necessitates an activity, an activity called reading, that we don't look at writing as something to be seen, we look at writing as something to be read. Obviously, certain cultures and certain forms will use the aesthetic quality of writing as ornamentation, but nonetheless writing itself is always intended to be read. And indeed, if you take certain modernist poetic practices, you can see it's that interplay between the visual aesthetic quality of words on a page coupled to their necessity to read them that gives you the force of the poem. And you can see that in anything from Stéphane Mallarmé through to Gertrude Stein, the experimental writers of the 20s and 30s. Therefore, there seems to be something proper to the material quality of writing, the demand that it be read. Now, what's true with a line is the demand, as it were, that it be seen, as opposed to be read. I mean, there used to be, when people used to talk about a reading of a painting, well, you don't read a painting, you look at it. You don't read a line, you look at a line. And therefore the question that you take to the line is a fundamentally different question than the one you take to the written word. The act of reading opens up and brings with it aesthetic and interpretive questions that, while linked to, are going to be different from the ones that mark out the looking at a line. Therefore, when we look at a line, we look at drawing, what we're interested in is what it presents. And what it presents is itself, the thing on the page, its material quality. But then we can ask that what does that presentation present? In the same way, if we're interested in museums, we can play on the twofold meaning of the English word display. We can say there is a display, but what does that display display? In other words, if there is an ideology or a political program or even just an aesthetic sensibility linked to a display, then the display displays that. In other words, there's always a sort of doubled quality. But the doubled quality is not inherent in the meaning, though it is. The meaning of the visual line, much like the meaning of the museum display, resides in a visual quality. Something is there before the eye, something is being presented apart from itself. There's a force at work that's in addition to the simple material presence of the line or the empirical presence of the line. Therefore, we're constrained to talk about a language of presentation. What does this line present, independently or in relation to its simple self? And therefore, that brings us back to what I was trying to talk about yesterday and the day before, is that while it's possible to talk about lines, the idea that lines simply exist in and of themselves, it has a certain naivety. Lines are constructed. The line in Descartes' drawings was different to the line in Fontenelle's drawings. The implicit line that was there when Hegel's thinking about the line was different to other ways in which the line was thought. So in our examination and our thinking about the nature of the line, we're always going back to its being more than that. Now, that gives you, if you like, a way into the problem that underlies everything, or one of the problems that underlies everything that I'm trying to talk through in these lectures, namely this question of presentation. What is it that the line presents in addition to itself? In addition to that mere physical mark, either on a screen or on a piece of paper, what does the line present? And I think that, to give you an example, though I'm not going to show it to you because it's always misleading to show people things. If you take a book by Colin Rowe, and if you look at the way in which he redeploys Vitko's redrawings of Palladio, what you see in addition to those redrawings is a commitment to the idea that the history of architecture is the history of the plan. So in Colin Rowe's work, when you look at the plan, what you're looking at is the image of architecture, because architecture is the plan, and hence the problem of the relationship between the plan and the section. Indeed, it's only the problem of trying to read the plan in the section, which, if you remember, is one of the bedeviling problems opened up by Korb. It's only that it only emerges as a dramatic problem because the history of architecture is the history of the plan. So when you look at the plan in Colin Rowe's work, what you're looking at is a certain commitment to what the image of architecture is, namely it's the image of the plan. So in all these cases, these lines present more than themselves. Therefore, we don't want to say that they represent, because the idea of representation understood in that sense gives us an external reality. Namely, there's something exterior that is presented at the interior. Now, that may be necessary for certain pragmatic qualities. For example, if you go to IKEA and buy whatever, and there's one of those diagrams that you get there, you really want that to have a direct relationship to the bookcase you're putting together. You don't want to see it as an interpretive moment of sort of bataille in excess. You want the bookcase to stand up. So there are moments where pragmatic determinism works, but leaving those to one side, what becomes interesting when we're looking at interpretable objects is the sorts of commitments that are at work in the presentation, that gives the presentation its force. In other words, they don't represent anything, they are the enactment of something. But what they're the enactment of is always more than the simple literal presence. That's why when you look at, when you evaluate a book by someone such as Colin Rowe, and you look at the illustrations, what they enact is a certain conception of what the history of architecture is, and hence what the image of architecture is. Now, therefore, I bring this up really to make more insistent the question that what matters with the line, what matters with drawing, is twofold. On the one hand is its, or sort of threefold indeed, is its literal presence, the technology possible to create that presence, and what is enacted with it. And those elements, if you like, should guide us in our thinking about the nature of the line. Now, having said that, that sets a framework, if you like, for what I want to say about Freud. Now, Freud obviously is of either no interest or great interest, but it must be both, to architecture. It's of no interest because it's psychoanalysis and not architecture, but that's just disavowal, so it's of central interest to architecture. Why? Well, firstly, because Freud, as I said in the very beginning of the lecture, draws obsessively. Secondly, because one of the great ruses of modernist architecture, and you see it in Adolf Loos's Villa Müller very clearly, is that if you can't read the internal logic of the building from the facade, then the facade operates, as others have pointed out, as a type of mask. There's a disjunctive relationship between the exterior and the interior. And that disjunctive relationship clearly marks a mode of thinking that's proper to psychoanalysis. I'm not so concerned with that, but as a historical entity, there is clearly a relationship between what's going on in architecture in the 20s and what's going on in psychoanalytic theory in the 20s. But that's of concern to architectural historians. It's not of concern to us. What's of concern to us is the way in which Freud draws. What he's interested in is how you can present the problem of the relationship between an immaterial system marked by force or activity and that which is necessarily different from it, namely something marked by the conscious, the stable, the masterable, that which has a different ontological framework. And it's this question of ontological frameworks, this word I introduced, came up with in our discussion yesterday. Namely, there are two differing understandings at work here. There's a notion of a dynamic process of force, and equally there's the idea of an enactment. And that relationship between force and enactment becomes very interesting. If you go back to contemporary physics, and this is something I only know about because I read about, I don't actually know about, what becomes very interesting in terms of elementary particles in string theory is that given a certain state of affairs, something can at a certain point be matter, and at some point it can be energy. In other words, that there is a disjunctive relationship between these elements. But therefore what we have to do, given that it comes from the same sort of source, is think about not that relation, but how that relation gets to be presented. And it's the presentation of that relation that interests me in Freud's drawings. Now, the reason why it's of interest to architecture, apart from all the other reasons I've just deduced, is that it dramatizes the general problem that we have with the diagram, and that is that we don't know how to read Freud's drawing. And what I want to suggest is the reason why we don't know how to read Freud's drawing is that it sets up a series of challenges that we're yet to fully confront. Namely, that we tend to see a drawing as a series of spatial determinations that are determined spatially. When someone asked a question yesterday about collage, the answer I gave probably wasn't clear enough, but this is the point I was trying to make. That what is interesting about collage, taken far too simply, is that it's the interruption of a grid by using the grid to undo it. But that's the least interesting thing one can say about a collage. The most interesting thing about a collage is that it doesn't interrupt space. It interrupts the temporality of the instant. Namely, that if the grid is a series of dots, dot, 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 or in the case of Ledoux in Show, a series of autonomous blocks, what gives each of these things persuasive force is that what you see is the totality of something existing in an instant. That's the way it is. So the very famous etching of the bird's eye view of Show gives you the reality of that utopian model completely. Now, a certain way of, as it were, deconstructing that would be to undo the autonomy of the block by showing by trying to overlap these blocks or implicate these blocks one to another by the layering of blocks. Now that on one level would undo a certain understanding of the collage, of the autonomous area, but it only does it on the level of space. It doesn't do it on the level of time. That's why the Piranesi example of the Campo Marzio becomes so central, because it's not simply a spatially disjunctive, it allows for the idea of temporal disjunction as well. Now, therefore, what you'd have at one moment, the moment of looking at something, is not simply spatial disjunction, but temporal disjunction. And it's this idea of reading the temporally disjunctive as present at a moment means that you have then a complex state of affairs. And I want to suggest, by looking at Freud's drawing, that this is the issue he's trying to wrestle with. He's trying to represent something that is not simply complex because it's difficult, it's not simply complex because it's the addition of elements, it's complex because it's the bringing together of a whole series of things that are fundamentally different. But it's their being fundamentally different that allows them, in some strange way, to be presented as the same. Now that's the point I want to reach towards the end of what I want to say tonight. So I want to give this some sort of setting. Now the setting is that and it's just to refer to a text that if you haven't read, you probably should, and that's the very famous text by Robin Evans on translation and drawing, which I think is one of the most significant pieces of investigation of the problem of drawing in architecture. He writes this: "It would be possible, I think, to write a history of Western architecture that would have little to do with style or signification, concentrating instead on the manner of working." Now, Robin Evans wrote this prior to the digital, prior to computers, prior to everything that we now know and take to be commonplace. But his insight was absolutely, in my view at least, absolutely right. It repeats, without him, I'm sure he did know it, but let's say he didn't, but it repeats exactly Gottfried Semper's argument in the 19th century, that architecture is not concerned with style or signification. In other words, architecture is not concerned with meaning. That's not to say that buildings don't mean. It's rather what architecture is concerned with is the way in which a certain structural state of affairs can have a meaning. In other words, meaning is a secondary effect of the operation of materials. Meaning is a secondary effect of the operation of geometries. Meaning is the secondary effect of the operation of program. And if you take programs, materials, and geometries together, then and as I would want to, I'd want to call that a material event. And indeed, a material event has a meaning. A material event has a signification. But the conditions of possibility for signification and meaning is that material event. So when he says that Western architecture has little to do with style or signification, instead we should concentrate on the manner of working, what we would be concentrating on is the way in which something came to be as architecture, the way it came to be in order to have that meaning. He goes on, "A large part of this history would be concerned with the gap between drawing and building. In it, drawing would be considered not so much a work of art or a truck for pushing ideas from place to place, but as the locale of subterfuge and evasions that one way or another gets round the enormous weight of convention that has always been architecture's greatest security and at the same time its greatest liability." In other words, that what's interesting here is he's allowing drawing to be a way of escaping a dominant tradition. In other words, is that me? It's engagement with the question of how you represent, of what is the image, and of seeing a disjunctive relationship between representation and image and how a building is then built, and to see in that space a site of research. Now, to see in the relationship between the ideas, the images and the drawing and the building, to see that just as a disjunctive relation, and therefore as a site of architectural research, what then becomes interesting is how do we fill in that gap? Now, I think there's a long argument to say that part of what characterized modern architecture is the recognition that that is a question, and the filling in of that gap is not a given anymore, that we negotiate that site endlessly. But what that does do always is then force us back to consider that the movement from line to building, given that it's disjunctive, it forces upon us the question of how do we fill it in, and therefore it forces upon us the question of the status of the line in the first place, or the status of the drawing in the first place. Given that disjunction, given this lack of pure continuity, we're forced back onto us is the question of what it is that I'm looking at. And I think there's something very interesting in his insight, made many, now 10, 15 years ago on that precise point. So therefore, what emerges from this very brief introduction is that, and it's exactly, Freud's point as well, that you can only approach the question of meaning if you see meaning as the after effect of a system or the after effect of an operation, of an operative quality. In other words, things don't have meaning from the beginning. They have meaning because of a certain play of forces, the result of which is meaning. So we don't look for meaning, we look for how meanings are constituted. And indeed, if you want to be more philosophical about it, the move from idealism to materialism is the move from meaning to meanings being the after effect of systems that produce them. So we're always interested in the latter, the systems that produce them. Now the naivety, on the other hand, is to think that meaning doesn't matter, or that program doesn't matter, or that these things are irrelevant to design. How could they be? But they're not prior to it. You don't have an idea and then work out what its architectural realization looks like. It's far more complicated than that. So what I want to suggest then is that once we're forced back to the question of the status of the image, of the status of what it is the drawing is, and this would come from someone like Robin Evans's work on the history of drawing, then we're forced back to the question that I was trying to say we were dealing with yesterday and the day before, namely the status of an image. And what I want to do now is look at the way in which Freud deals with this problem to see whether that'll take our thinking a bit further. In an envelope dated January the 7th, 1895, Freud sent a manuscript to Wilhelm Fliess. The manuscript contained 3 drawings. Each one attempted to show, or at the very least provide, a diagrammatic formulation, not of melancholia, and melancholia is that, just to give you the jargon, melancholia is that sense when you feel that you've lost something, but you can't identify what it is that has been lost. It's that sense of something is missing. In which he tried to diagrammatic formulation, not of melancholia, but of the operation or series of movements, the result of which is melancholia. So it's not melancholia, but that series of conditions to which one gives the name melancholia. Now, what is interesting is that this text written in 1895, this letter, this drawing, is actually done prior to Freud's major writings, the so-called metapsychological papers, the central one of which is the 1915 paper on the unconscious. Now, in the 1915 paper on the unconscious, Freud draws an important distinction that I referred to yesterday between a topographical description of the unconscious, which is simply what you could draw, and an economic model. And the economic model had to do with the fact that what enabled the unconscious to be constituted was the operation of force. In other words, that if you repress something, the maintaining of what is repressed involves the expenditure of what Freud would call psychic energy. And that expenditure of energy is fundamental to maintain a distinction between the unconscious and the conscious, a distinction that we could describe topographically. Now, I think this is of enormous interest, whether you're interested in architecture or the unconscious or urbanism or whatever it is, because what that gives you is the idea that a topographical model will never on its own capture relationships unless those relationships are static. Why? Because relationships involve the economic. Not in terms of money, but they involve movement. You can't understand a city unless you can see that down roads run cars. But they don't just run as a continuous movement. It changes from one hour to the next. You can interrupt the flow and something else happens. In other words, unless you had an economic model, you wouldn't understand how to make an urban map. It's not ever accomplished topographically. Now, I'm about to use a very rude word. A topographical model is the one used by planners. That's why they don't understand the way the urban operates, because they think it's all two-dimensional. If we introduce the economic, then we know that fundamental to the urban structure is the movement of force. And then the mapping question, and this is why landscape urbanism is so interesting, the mapping question becomes the relationship between the topographical and the economic, which is precisely what Freud is wrestling with, but not in relation to urbanism, in relation to our psychic lives. Now, he develops this distinction in his 1915 paper on the unconscious, and which he has some rather ornate drawings, but we don't have time to... There's a whole lot of these Freud and drawing lectures. I'm just giving you highlights from the series. There isn't time to get to the very end ones. I just want to stick to this very early one because I think it sets the problem very clearly. But Freud does draw, or attempt to draw, the economic model in the 1915 paper on the unconscious. Now, in this letter to Fleece, written 7th of January 1895, the drawings, as Freud makes clear in the letter, were intended to clarify what was being argued in the manuscript that was in the letter, which was only published after Freud's death. The drawing, which is entitled The Normal Scheme, prompted the following account from the editor and translator of the English language edition of the Freud-Fleece correspondence. I quote, "It was not included in the original German or English editions, probably because it was so difficult to understand. It is reproduced here along with its reverse side, which is evidently an explanation of it. And what I've given you is an English translation of the redrawing of the first part of the sketch. So you should have that to look at. Now, the problem of the editors had simply no idea what to make of this drawing, so they didn't include it. It's only just recent, only in the last 20 or 30 years been published. The problem of the interpretive difficulties posed by the drawing provides the point of departure. Not because it's essential to spend time reading the details of the drawing, though we will, but because what is set in play is the question of the status of the drawing, namely, what does it represent? Now, this is easy to do when we play with psychoanalysis, but I would say that you should do the same when, as you must do at least once a week, go and look at, was it Albertina 156A, which is, of course, the great drawing of the wall of Borromini's San Carlo Riccardo Fontane. And you look at that drawing, and you should take precisely the same question to it. Namely, what does it represent? What does it present? What does it enact? Now, once we believe that this question is not explicable in terms of adequacy or truth, but what actually goes on is an attempt to link drawing to a presentation that is both topographical and involves process. In other words, we can begin to see a drawing as the site of topography, topographical, but equally the site of process. What I was trying to say yesterday about this relationship between the finite and the infinite, if you look at a Borromini drawing, and if you think a little bit about Leibnizian calculus, you can then see that, and the way in which the curvilinear would operate, you could then see that these lines are after effect of a series of calculations. It's not as though they're original, like this is the first and only line. What you see there is the result of a series of calculations, but they're calculations enacted by drawing instruments. There is a further complicating element, as I'm trying to make clear. Within topography, force figures, and force is time as much as anything else. To the extent that a distinction between what Freud would call the unconscious and the conscious is held in place, any attempt to represent that divide has to present two domains with two different temporal registers. In other words, that the line has to be both itself and a site of potentiality. And it's this attribution of potentiality to a line that will always lift it above its mere empirical instantiation, such that you can then say, what happens when that potentiality is realized? When I talk next week about Malevich, as I did earlier last semester, I want to make a lot of Malevich's description of abstraction as potentiality. In other words, that's what he understands abstraction to be. And if that's what abstraction is potentiality, then the question that we have to ask, because we're not interested in art, we're interested in architecture, is what happens when that potentiality is realized? Or what does it mean to realize the potentiality of the abstract? And so it's a 1920s fascination with abstraction as having an operative dynamic quality and not being just a flat white sight of absence, but as always having more. So given that, we have both what's there in front of us, but to see it as a site of potentiality, to see it as therefore the play of two different temporal registers. Now in regard to this particular drawing, if the boundary between them is drawn, then the line marks that temporal divide. If I draw a line that says on the one hand is the conscious, on the other hand is the unconscious, how do we understand that drawn line? I mean, it's the same, though it's not the same, sort of argument one could say, look, here is a division of a city between one group and another. Therefore, how does one understand that line? If you have, as you must do, have a look at, what's his name? I forget his surname now, Whittaker's wonderful book on Roman frontiers. What becomes interesting is if you take the edge condition, which you think is a line that separates the Romans from the Scots. If you take Hadrian's Wall, everyone thinks that these are lines that divide. They're not. They're inherently porous. Not only are they inherently porous lines, they're lines that attract, program in virtue of being lines. So lines both divide and connect. Lines both divide and allow for movement. But therefore, given that the line never separates absolutely, how does one begin to operate and understand the nature of the line? If you take, for example, the line that divides the ghetto in any medieval city, what marks the main thing that makes the ghetto work is not simply at a certain time everyone in the ghetto has to go back, but that guards are posted. In other words, that line works because it's enforced. So the line doesn't separate. What separates are the forces enabling that line to be an act of separation. So one has to see the drawn line as both. So overcoming the ghetto does not have to do with pulling down the walls. It has to do with recognizing that the walls are held in place by force, in the most brutal and literal sense. So what that line enacts is division that's spatial, but because it's spatial, it has to be maintained, and it's maintained by a play of force. So what the line enacts is precisely that. So the line will always be more than simple topography. And that's what I'm arguing that Freud is trying to wrestle with when he draws. And I'd also want to suggest that when you draw, these are some of the issues that you begin to wrestle with. So let me go on then. The 1895 text of Freud's, identified enigmatically by the editors as Manuscript G, concerns an early theory of melancholia. The argumentation starts from the observed connection of melancholia and what Freud describes as sexual anesthesia. After identifying the working hypotheses that stem from this connection, the manuscript continues by way of a discussion of what Freud calls the schematic diagram of sexuality. It is not just these hypotheses are concerned with loss, in the case of melancholia. Loss is explicable in terms of a redistribution or the deadening, the anesthetizing of energy. What is lost occurs within what Freud describes, I now quote him, the life of the drives. Now the drives, the German word Trieb, we can translate this into another German word if we want to, which is Kraft, which is wrong, but it'll work. In other words, what we have here is a dynamic quality. In other words, already in the text, Freud, you don't have to worry about whether you are interested in melancholia. That doesn't matter. What matters is that melancholia, this psychological state, is taken to be the explicable, not in terms of its meaning, but in terms of its creation by a play of forces. And this early work of Freud's is very interesting because it's all about dynamic forces. Now, the idea guiding the treatment of the topic is that what melancholia consists in is mourning over the loss of libido. That's what he defines. So melancholia is already linked to a notion of loss. Now, accounting for this loss necessitates recourse to our diagram. The importance of the first figure is what it tries to display as movement and the deadening or loss of movement. What is prompting this account is the need to explain and account for the loss of excitation. This occurrence does not happen by the simple removal of the energy involved, but it's being diverted from what he calls the psychic sexual group. We'll just have a little talk about psychoanalysis for a moment, then I'll move to the diagram. Indeed, Freud will go on to describe genuine or severe melancholia in terms of a cessation of the production of sexual excitation. In other words, it's the impossibility of sexual arousal, which you merely take to be having an off day, but is actually linked to something else. In other words, it has to be read symptomatically. It doesn't exist in itself. What it exists in is a relation to this sense of loss. So the loss of excitation is a loss linked to, for Freud, melancholia. This cessation has to be described, and Freud wants to find a language to describe the loss of energy. So he uses a wave theory. He talks about it's a loss of waves. Instead of this repetitive action of waves, these waves become stilled. The loss is therefore a change in modulation or frequency. In other words, there is an account that is given of this process that we call melancholia in terms of process itself. Now, there are two further instances of melancholia detailed in the text that I just want to note in passing. The first is described as what he calls the neuro-asthenetic model. Here what is being described is that setup where what he describes as excessive masturbation leads to a diminution of the psychic sexual drive. In other words, there's too much energy being expended somewhere, therefore there's a sense of loss related to that. The decrease of energy is almost literal, and that's on one level interesting but not as interesting as the next part. In the second, I quote, the sexual tension is diverted rather than diminished. It is reinvested. This is one of Freud's great insights, that it's not as though things just vanish. The way in which we begin to account for a particular psychological state of affairs is that energy that is directed to one area is diverted to another. And that diversion gives us a psychoanalytic setup which we could call, for example, melancholia. So it's not a mood, it's the result of a process. And I think what is interesting is then one would want to begin to distinguish between states of affairs that need to be understood psychoanalytically and therefore pathologically, and something like a mood. But that's a separate question. But what is interesting then is the way in which these emerge. The site where that reinvestment, this moving of one's energy from one place to another, is what Freud identifies as the boundary. And you'll see this in the drawing in a moment. The boundary is drawn onto the diagram. It is the line marked in the middle, the somat-psychic boundary. And in this, and I'll go through the diagram in more detail in a moment, what is Freud's trying to describe is two psychological positions: the position of the ego or the I, the position of the other, the position of the world, and the position of the self. But it's one of the most complicated and demanding things about psychoanalysis is this. The general understanding is there's me and the world, or there's me and the other person. But what psychoanalysis indicates is that if repression is constitutive of the unconscious, then it's not simply that I am not master of myself, I am other to myself. So I am always already divided. So there is both the unconscious and the conscious. Now, whether one believes this or not is a separate question, but just run with it for a moment. There is this act of repression that is constitutive of the unconscious, means that I am transparent to myself, but I am also other to myself. Equally, the other person has that precise setup in themselves. Now, they may have unconscious desires that they are not master of, or they have conscious desires that I only respond to unconsciously, or on the level of the unconscious. So you can see that this diagram of self-other relations, which we take to be so terribly straightforward, there's just me and the other. And this is one of the great problems with philosophy, that always thinks it's a self-other relation. There's also the more dramatic problem of the other in me, this unmasterable element that is in me, that is constitutive of me. Now, in psychoanalysis, that becomes interesting in terms of treatment, becomes interesting in terms of of engagement, even on self-understanding. It's of interest to us because what it gives us is the idea that in the beginning there was more than one. Namely, that if what the self is this irreducible site between conscious and unconscious activity that can't be resynthesized, and yet there's always a movement across the divide, then as something that makes us think, and this is what's interesting, as something that makes us think, what it shows us is that in the beginning there was always already more than one. Therefore, the one always occurs after recognizing that this complexity is there from the beginning. Unity occurs after the event. When I say it's me, what I'm actually saying is there is a complex state of affairs that is at work. And when I talk about Malevich next week, Malevich's work on the zero and the one, as Lissitzky's work on the zero and the one, indicates precisely this problem. Now, I mean, there is never a 0 point from which things begin. Things are always already more than one. Now, that's the insight in terms of Freud's theory of the self. Now, the reason why that interests us is that then when the line is drawn, what the line has to mark is precisely that state of affairs. Namely, what the line has to mark is the drawn line, which is, as it were, always already more than one. So therefore, the status of the drawn line has far greater complexity, because the Cartesian view would be the drawn line is a simple line existing, and that's all there is. Anything else occurs after the event. That's where we get the Cartesian point or the axiom. We saw with Leibniz yesterday, that it seems like last week was just yesterday, that that's not the case. With the Freudian problem, with the question of the line, once we bring in the thinking of the self proper to that, what we then see is that we have now a state of affairs that's always already more than one in relation to the nature of the self, and that's the problem of the drawn line, of what it represents. Now, architecture is not psychoanalysis, but you can see the problem that Freud has with drawing is going to have a very interesting affinity to the question of drawing in architecture. So let me just say more about the particular drawing we have in front of us. So there is a series of boundary relations set up. A line has been drawn which constitutes these. Now, working with the assumption that this anesthetic effect I was describing is the omission of the feelings of pleasure, the measure of this feeling is given in terms of the amount of pleasure that is released elsewhere. So energy is dispersed from one site to another. If, as Freud writes, and I quote, everything below is working, and yet the feeling of pleasure is not given to the psychic sexual group, then the absence of movement provides a description of hysteria, or of hysterical anesthesia. The responses are to be explained by defense in both instances. Now, the relation between melancholia and anesthesia is expressed by Freud in the following terms. Let me just give you the quotation. He says, melancholia is related to the omission of the somatic sexual tension. Anesthesia is related to that omission. But anesthesia is a sign of or preparation for melancholia, since this psychic group is as much weakened by this absence as by the omission of sexual tension. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the right way of understanding melancholia. What interests me is that this is a description of melancholia, not as a state of loss, as though one overcomes the feeling of melancholia by remembering something. I mean, what's so interesting about, in psychoanalytic terms, about mourning, and if you've ever lost a relative or a friend, you have mourned, and that mourning reaches a certain point where it ceases to be mourning, but becomes remembering. And at that move from mourning to remembering, you can forget. It's not a problem, then you recall it. It's never as straightforward as that. But mourning then becomes very interesting. There's a sense of loss that is not simply, you don't feel better by remembering the person. You've lost someone or you've lost something and you feel dreadful about it, but their memory doesn't make you feel any better. So therefore there's something fundamentally different between mourning and remembering. Now, without going into it in great detail, what's different is that we can't control mourning. That's why it can become pathological. We can control remembering. We can just switch it off. I can remember, I don't. But we can't control the feeling of mourning. We can't deal with the sense of loss by simply recalling the person's face. You don't feel good about it. You probably feel even worse. And that's what mourning is. Now what's interesting then for us is that mourning and melancholia in this very specific sense are the results of processes that are at work. We give them a single name, but they're processes, and this is the interesting part, they're processes that are not masterable. The question of memory is masterable. I want to recall a face, I recall it, I'm pleased I can recall it, I move on. If someone who's very close to you have died after a number of years, you could even, if you want to, recall their voice, you might have a good feeling about it, but it's something that, it's never as absolute as this, I assure you, it's far more ambivalent. But it's something over which you feel you can exercise a type of control. What's interesting about mourning is that you cannot exercise control. What's interesting about melancholia is you cannot exercise control. Now that doesn't mean that you're weak or feeble. It means that the nature of the self is always already divided between, as it were, conscious life, in which there is some sense of mastery, and the unconscious, over which there is no mastery. But more significantly, it's the relationship between both of these elements that is constitutive of the self. So it's the relationship between an immaterial and the material, between the conscious and the unconscious, between a process and a static instance that is actually constitutive of the truth of things. Now that, in regard to the theory of the self, that becomes, as I'm trying to indicate, very interesting. But what becomes more interesting, I think, architecturally, is that this gives us the concepts and categories within which we can begin to understand the problem of drawing once we move away from representation. That's why one response to these lectures is to say, no, I just want to see them as representations because anything else is just much more complicated. And that's fine. It's not the truth of things, but it's fine. But when you have to move outside the realm of truth and falsity, that this is the picture and this is the truth and I can establish it, it's not simply that it's more complicated, it's that we struggle to find a language in which to describe it. Now, this very interesting diagram, which I'm yet to come to, though I realise time is marching on, it structures all the relationship between the elements in terms of what Freud in 1895 describes as a theory of defence. And it's very interesting. In 1895, you can, if you're interested in Freud, you get the first intimations of the theory of repression. Now, the theory of repression is only fully worked out much later on. But again, you find hints of it in a letter of December the 6th, 1896, when Freud writes and first uses the word to Fliess, and Fliess becomes this fundamental person with whom he develops this theory. But what the notion of defence gives you, much like the theory of repression, is that movement around this diagram is not as straightforward as we seem. Now, what's there in the diagram? One final point before I get to this. The point I want to make is that the language that we need to generate in order to understand the diagram gives us the idea of a complexity that's there at the very beginning. If you take the idea of the relationship between, what constitutes the self is the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, there's a complexity that you can't synthesize and which is there from the beginning. If you take the diagram as having a potential for representation, but itself as not being representational, despite its being a drawn line, then it's complex from the very beginning. It's originally complex. And I would want to argue that we need a word, and the word I use to describe this is anoriginal, A-N-O-R-I-G-I-N-A-L. And in my jottings I try and make a lot of this word. And I think that the idea of anoriginal complexity marks out a way of thinking about both the self in a psychoanalytic sense and the diagram of sites of something that is, as it were, always already more than one. Now, if you take that wonderful moment from the Christian Bible where it says, in the beginning was the Word, it's not. In the beginning was the Word, but the Word had two meanings. Or, in the beginning there are a couple of words. But it's this idea that in the beginning there was always already more than one. And therefore, we have the question of how to understand the point. And I'd like to point out the argument I was trying to make in relation to Leibniz last night. So this diagram, to turn to it, contains two boundaries. The horizontal axis is the somat psychic boundary, and the vertical axis is the ego boundary. The location of the psychological is positioned in the top left-hand domain. The body is the site of sexual activity, feelings and pleasure is of course placed beneath. It is a location given by and held in place by the somat psychic body. The vertical boundaries between the I, and the Germans, bless them, use the word ich, which is I, and not the word ego, which is our rather pathos-driven translation of ich. And so, when, for that most delicate of creatures, the German ear, when it hears ich, what it hears is the interplay between the I and what we would call the ego. So don't read it as the ego as though it's not the I. It's the I/ego boundary and the world. It is the domain, therefore, of self-other relations. Equally, in dividing the I, this ich, from the world, it allows for a presentation of the psychological structures to act in the world. In the diagram, the arrow traces the movement of sexuality. The arrow marks the processes that can come to be disrupted or diverted. And again, if there was time and there's not, there's a whole lecture course one could give, which I won't, on the role of arrows in drawing. People don't discuss arrows enough. But if you look at Descartes' drawing, it's replete with arrows, much in the way in which Freud draws continuously with arrows. In other words, the problem that both Descartes had when it came to, as I was talking about last night, les esprits animaux, the animal spirits, was how do you represent them? Well, you do it with arrows. What Freud wants to have, because he doesn't have animation software, and this becomes the interesting part, is the only way he can talk about movement is precisely because the only way he can do it is with arrows. And so we see arrows, but what we see when we look at the arrow is process at work. But process is never pure process. Processes cross a series of divides. You can see that you could take this diagram, it would be very interesting, if one ran the world and one doesn't, to take this as an urban study. You could begin to see in what sense you could base a whole studio on taking this as a city, and then working out how all of these relationship between the lines, the processes, the movement, how that would operate. What urbanism is at play in this drawing? Now, the arrows, as I say, mark the process. It can be disrupted or diverted, much like process and movement always can be. The systems work when the flow of energy is maintained and release occurs through the terminal organ. Moving clockwise around the diagram, the four sections are the psychological self, the external world to which relations are made by that self, the external world in relations to the body self, the bodily self. But yet it's as though Freud knows this immediately. Once you set up a division between me and the world, the only thing that has to be discussed is how you represent relationality. But this was the point I was trying to make against Hegel, what price hubris, last night, by saying the only way he could think about relationality was, about connection, was through negation. That, I am me and you are you, based on a structure of negation. Therefore, relationality can't be thought. But what can be thought, what has to be thought, if separation is the case, is the nature of relation. And what is implicit in the Freudian diagram is that in the end, the individuated self is an after effect of a process. And indeed, if one wants to have a notion of self or a notion of ego, as opposed to this, then it's an after effect of a process that constitutes it. Much like melancholia is a state of affairs that's an after effect of the process that constitutes it, that we call it then melancholia. So the whole idea of division and relation, which we see compartmentalized, and we take it as there from the beginning and say, this is separate, therefore how is there a relation, is the wrong question. The right move is to say, given that there's always already relation, how does individuation occur within that? And individuation is something taking on a specific quality, but it's a very good word. It gives you the idea of the individual not as there prior to anything else, but the individual as the after effect of a system. Now, not a system that need be synthetic or unified. Here is a system that involves the conscious, the unconscious, the masterable, the unmasterable, etc., etc. All these things fundamentally different, But all of the individual elements are individuated by the system. So the wrong question would be to ask about my relation to you. The right question is, given that there's always already a relation, what then? And that's exactly the process that we're seeing here. Movement backwards, so the only way we can account for pathologies is by having to use the wrong language, but I think it's helpful in this instance, an ecological model. If you have, you take the standard, Architecture 101 model of the pond, and in the pond there are the reeds, and then there's the rock, and on top of the rocks it's the bird who eats the bugs that come because there's the weeds, etc., who eats the fish, and all of this works. You take out one element and see what happens. You can only understand the system because each of those individual elements are individuated by the system. Therefore, the damage to one damages the whole lot, precisely because the system itself individuates the elements. This is an ecological model in that precise sense, that there aren't four elements that then get to be in relation. There's a system that individuates the elements in relation. So movements backwards and forwards across the boundaries is to be understood as flows of energy positioned within a dynamic system. And that is a dynamic system with flows of energy. That's how we describe it. It is only by retaining the centrality of energy flows, and thus a purely dynamic theory, that the diagram is able to maintain the imposition of boundaries in terms of the retained presence of a type of XY axis. I think you can begin to see this as a type of XY axis. In the same way as differential calculus, as I was trying to suggest last night, will allow for a diagrammatic presentation of the rotation of a volume around the XY axis, Freud's diagrams allow for the charting of movement. Central to both positions is that movement around the axis or movement across does not itself demand a conceptual shift, such that a representation of the process would be rendered problematic. There is a presentation, but it's not the presentation of a static state of affairs. This is the presentation of a dynamic state of affairs. And that's what's so interesting. Again, it's the same question that keeps coming, or examples I always use. If you take Ledoux and put it next to this, they look the same. There are divisions, there are separations, there seem to be autonomy. And yet, they're fundamentally different. The trick is, of course, the great thing is, I think, I don't know whether you can bring Ledoux's bird's eye view of show to mind. If you can't, you should. You've got the city, you've got the road out of the city, and then you've got this appalling green stuff, nature. And what becomes interesting is autonomy, of course, as the city is being autonomous to nature. And he wants, therefore, to think this as disjunctive, but there's the road. And if you understood that road as the problem of how to eliminate the ineliminability of process, then you could see that even in the static, you'll always have the problem of the dynamic. And Freud knows that, because the dynamic, for him, is constituted of the static. So this is a static image of a dynamic process. It's exactly the same problem. The reason why Leibniz was opposed to the idea of a watch as being a real unity is it was just an assemblage of parts, and therefore could not be a unity. The only way you could have a unity is if it contained multiplicity. In other words, if it contained the dynamic. So in a Leibnizian sense, to really push it, this is a unity precisely because it's a dynamic system. And as it unfolds, it generates differing states of affairs, but its unfolding is what matters. The states of the affairs, the finite moments, are parasitic upon this as a dynamic process. This as a dynamic process individuates the finite states of affairs. That's why, in a medical sense, we can treat melancholia, because we understand it as a consequence of the operation of a dynamic system, which working one way we call melancholia, working another way we don't view as pathological at all. But it's a system at work. Now, in terms of either rotation or movement, it is in terms of either rotation or movement that time can be reintroduced. As I've tried to indicate, I suppose for years now, to me, time is the very condition of spatiality. You cannot think spatiality unless you understand that what you're seeing is a temporal dimension. And therefore the deconstruction or the interruption of the temporal will always have to involve the spatial. As I said last night, that's what I think makes Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York such a problematic book, in which it operates spatially, and doesn't really worry as much about the question of temporal interruption or temporal disjunction or temporal overlap as it does spatial. So it's in terms of either rotation or movement that time can be reintroduced. Volumes revolve within sequential time. The movement from one set of coordinates to another can be given a temporal description. The point at which the coordinates contain where x equals 0 or y equals 0 can themselves be noted. There is a possibility to read this as an xy axis that at a certain moment x or y will equal 0 when a line is crossed. These are the points where either one or either one of the lines comprising the xy axis are crossed. Moreover, any set of coordinates containing a 0 mark the boundary. But don't forget this whole question of the 0, which Malevich, I'll make a lot about with Malevich. The question of the 0 can never be seen as just that. It's always the crossing of a boundary by process. Therefore, the 0, even as a 0 condition, is always more than that. There are two important considerations here. In the first instance, the quality of the line before and after such points is the same. Equally within Freud's diagram, as the line crosses one of the boundaries, the quality of the line does not change. Secondly, that the nature of the domains allows for connection and integration. What this means is that the line is constrained to represent a continuity across division, precisely because it sustains continuity, sustaining it despite the division. The continuity, one given its fullest account by the inclusivity of the diagram, is the self of the self-world or the self-other relation. The continuous line draws the continuity of the subject's being with itself and the subject's being in the world. The temporality of that continuity is, of course, the temporality of narrative. The lines of the diagram represent a sequence, the unfolding of which is, from a certain version, the narrative instantiation of self. Now, what's so interesting is that I'll try and wrap up a little bit. What's so interesting about the word narrative is that narrative is determined by the concept of sequential continuity. Even those, deliciously modern novels that try and interrupt sequential continuity do so by disrupting sequential continuity, which, hey, we notice. So narrative is built into a question of the operation of a certain understanding of time. And time is understood as sequence. Things are meaningful because they're in a sequence. Think of subjects, verbs, and objects. Think of the structure of a sentence. It's sequential. Even if we get it round the other way, it's order that allows for meaning. It's time that allows for meaning. Now, the interesting thing that Freud says in a much later text is that the processes of the system of the unconscious are, and I quote him, timeless. And what he means by timeless is that they don't have the structure of narrative, but they're productive of narratives, but they don't have the structure of narratives. So what we then see if we take Freud's later writings about, and you see that this movement across boundaries is involving a movement between the masterable and the unmasterable, the conscious and the unconscious. It's not simply that this is a series of spatial interruptions. It's not simply that these involve differing registers. What's so important is that there are differing time frames at work. And it's that differing time frames at work that mean that what then gets to be represented is not the possibility of a sharp cleavage. In other words, these boundary conditions, on the one hand, mark real divisions, and yet what they mark are separations, the nature of which cannot be represented. Go back to the Roman frontier. What marks out the Roman frontier, Hadrian's Wall is a perfect example. You see the drawn line that is Hadrian's Wall. Just get on a train, go to Edinburgh, walk for a bit, you'll see it, Hadrian's Wall. It marks a drawn line on the map. Any analysis of the drawn line indicates that it's porous. More than that, the drawn line operates as an attractor of program, markets, people selling things, etc., etc. So this line becomes a division but equally in being a division, it works as an attractor. It keeps people out only on the basis that it's porous. In other words, that what gives the line its truth is being the operation of a series of differing activities, none of which can be represented by the drawing of a line. And yet what the drawn line enacts is precisely that. So the diagram, to make Hadrian's Wall a diagram, would not be to see it as a division between two things, but to see it as a division between two things, where that division was always overdetermined and marked by porosity and movement, marked by attraction as much as repulsion. So everything that, as it were, you think intuitively a drawn line would not be, a frontier is always going to be. Now, if you take all of these frontiers, all of these boundary conditions, Freud cannot draw the consequences of the movement around it. He can't draw that as one line is crossed, something changes. I mean, again, let's be incredibly stupid just for a moment, incredibly literal. This line looks the same on either side. If it looks the same on either side, then it must be the same on either side. If you're using your A to Z, you'd want it to be the same on either side. You wouldn't, when it crossed the Balls Pond Road, think that something truly dramatic happened. The unrepresentable had been breached by the encounter with Stoke Newington or something like that. You'd want a map that worked quite happily. Yes? Now here, because it's not that notion of mapping happily, we can't see, despite the fact that they look the same, this line and this line as being the same. Therefore, if that's the case, this has potential. It has potential because when I do my urban study based on this, it's the qualitative difference between these two that's not represented on this but is constitutive of this, that I would then have to enact. In other words, I'd want to see not simply this line as movement while these lines are static. I'd want to see this all as a process, and so this borderline here, this point here, is a site of negotiation and complication. Now, if I wanted, therefore, to take the truth of this, I would have to, as it were, plan and section these points of encounter. These moments where lines are crossed and something happens would have to be studied, I'm about to sneeze, would have to be studied in much greater detail than can be represented by this. In other words, this is diagrammatic in the precise sense that it's not representational. However, it's diagrammatic in the precise sense that it will generate representations. In other words, this is a diagram because it has potentiality. This has a potentiality urbanistically, because we could begin to detail and detail and detail it. We could begin to see these plays of forces, these lines, etc., all of which are generative. But what's interesting is we don't know the what, the that, of which they're generative. It could generate a number of differing possibilities. And again, that possibility is itself precluded by the structure of representation. The structure of representation will preclude the idea that this is generative of a number of different things. Why? Because those different things that would be generated would have a disjunctive relationship to this. Those different things would not represent this, because there is no one thing to be presented. This becomes the site of activity. Now, therefore, what becomes interesting in thinking about the problems Freud has in drawing is that the truth of psychoanalysis is linked to this relationship between all of these elements I've tried to give you, between the temporal and the atemporal, between the dynamic and the static, etc., etc. But they're not alternatives. They're always already implicated. They're always already related. There is, as I said, an original complexity that marks out as much the self as it does this question of diagramming. Therefore, what the questions that we take to these sorts of drawings is not what they stand for, not what they represent, but what potential they have. And eventually, if this becomes a building, obviously it's not, if it becomes a building, then you have to plan and section. Then you have to have something that you send to the builder of the space frame or the maker of the brick or whatever it is. At a certain moment, something has a quality, but that moment is not implicit. And that goes back to the very first lecture I gave about the question of the archive. Archiving follows a linear narrative only when it's structured around the idea that every step leads inexorably and inevitably to the next. What Robin Evans, in the quotation I gave from the very beginning, is questioning is that necessity so to do. Namely, if we paid more attention to diagramming, though he doesn't use the word, we would begin to see that the interruptive question, the idea of criticality in architecture, to be polemical, does not lie in having an interesting program, though it may. It lies in another possibility within the diagram, another possibility of drawing one's way out of a certain predicament, of refusing to see inevitability in a particular drawing, taking a drawing as autonomous in the sense that it's generative not just of one thing. But that's only possible if one attributes a diagrammatic, non-representational force to a drawing, rather than it seeing as only generative of one thing. So therefore this, while having absolute detail, is abstract. But it's abstract in the precise sense that it's generative. It's not abstract in the sense that it doesn't mean anything, or it's so abstract. It's abstract in the precise sense that it's generative. But that precise sense means that we can spend hours, and I've only just begun, detailing this play of forces, detailing the self-other elements within it, detailing in the abstraction. Now it sounds slightly oxymoronic to say detailing the abstraction. That's precisely what one would do with a drawing like this. One would detail and detail and detail the abstraction, and what you're doing there is giving greater clarity or greater precision to the abstraction, and therefore allowing it to have a more exacting generative force. So the value then, I mean, just to sum up then, the value then of these investigations of Freud's drawings hardly reside in the aesthetic quality of the drawing. Hardly. I mean, you don't put this in a frame, stick it on a wall and think, hey, maybe you do. What they reside in is the capacity for drawing to engage with a whole series of problems. The problem of the relationship, as I said, between the static and the dynamic, just to begin with. Now, because we've moved to a state of affairs where we don't have to have an XY axis, we can have an XYZ axis, and hence we can think about how animation operates with the static as much as static with the dynamic. We can do this a stage further. But in here resides the problem that we confront. Namely, systems are operative. But systems are not just pure system, they always arrive in something. They resolve in one way and move on to something else. That the dynamic is not pure becoming. The dynamic, as Leibniz teaches us, always finds form. And then it will find other forms. There isn't such a thing as pure system. Nonetheless, there's the operational. Again, there's no such thing as a pure system. It's impure, and may we celebrate the impure, because it's the unconscious and the conscious. It's the masterable, the unmasterable, the this and the that. This a notion of, in the beginning, there's always more than one. All of this, I would suggest to you, is at play in Freud's drawing. So in sum, what I tried to do today was firstly complicate, because that's a good thing, the question of representation, to try and indicate that it... Sorry. Please, I thought it was just me. Blah, 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 blah. Complicate the question of representation, because complicating things is a good thing. It's a virtue, as Aristotle might have said. In order then to say that once we move away from thinking in a certain way, we then have to confront a whole range of other possibilities. But the virtue of that, and this is I'm serious now, the virtue of that is the freedom it gives us, the capacity to be imaginative, not to have to see this as representational. To refuse that opens up an incredible range of invention. In other words, that freedom to some extent emerges precisely in that moment where I have to take on the responsibility of thinking in a different way. Not by doing anything, but by having to think in a different way, by not seeing this as representational and taking that very seriously. Now, because there's no one way of doing this, I looked at a drawing by Freud, which is, as the Americans say, I was sharing this with you. I obsessed by Freud's drawings, and I wanted to get this out in the open and tell you about it. So I did, and I feel much better for it. But what's interesting about Freud's drawings is that he is one of the very first to deal with the problem of how you draw a system. Now, not because he's interested in systems per se, but he knows, though it's not his language, that individuals are individuated by systems. that psychic states of affairs are individuated by the operation of systems. In other words, that the individual or the individuated is always the after effect of a system at work. Now, whether that becomes psychoanalysis or urbanism, and the difference must be profound, what becomes interesting is that's our problem. And therefore, the relation between the static and the dynamic is to think of two things working always together as one. So what I did very briefly, and probably far too briefly, took you through some of the elements within the drawing to try and indicate how this is at work. Now, tomorrow, I want to talk about something, as I say, completely different, which is Walter Benjamin's attempt to deal with the question of drawing and the drawn line. And I'll hand out a little text, and we'll have a sort of, explication de text, go through an impossibly difficult text to try and understand how he would think the question on the line. Now, just before you go, what's interesting historically, and one needs to make this point, is that Benjamin is writing his paper on the line in the 20s, at the same time as that Gershom Scholem writes a very short text on painting. It's the same time that Malevich is worrying about the relationship between suprematism and drawing. It's the same time, 1926, when Kandinsky writes his important text on the point and the line. There's something interesting historically going on in Europe at that particular moment, where a number of architects, painters, philosophers, whatever, are trying to understand the relationship between point and line within a structure of process. Not their word, but poor old Malevich runs to suprematism to try and give him a way of theorizing a notion of process. He didn't need that. He could have done something else. But what's going on in all of them is the attempt to think of points and lines as after effects of systems. So it's worthwhile looking at these impossibly difficult things to begin to understand that the problems that we have in understanding the diagram, understanding the image on the screen, can be given a contextualization, can be given a history, the study of which I think is going to be helpful. Okay, that's enough. So, I won't ask for questions because my voice is tired. We will have lots of questions next week, but let's talk about Walter Benjamin tomorrow. Thank you.